Looks like a big pile of mud, doesn't it? That's basically what it is. Many tourists that go to Israel bypass this. For one, it's in the West Bank area, and sometimes tour buses get rocks thrown at them and stuff like this. But actually, it's just a big pile of mud. It really is. There are buildings underneath that, and that's what Jericho sort of looks like today. Today, there's an Italian team that's been digging there for years. Let's see, I think they started around 2015, so they're doing some dig. During COVID, everything was shut down. There were no digs going on. But this is Jericho. Now, I want you to understand something that a lot of people don't catch. When the Bible talks about Jericho in the Old Testament, this is the place. When it's talking in the Gospels about Jericho, this is not the place. There's an Old Testament Jericho, which is what I'm going to be talking on, about a quarter of a mile to a half a mile over to the right of where this picture is the New Testament Jericho, where Jesus healed Bartimaeus and other things. That's where that takes place. So that was not here. So there's two different Jerichos. The New Testament Jericho, there's a lot of ruins there and stuff. That Herod the Great, he built a palace there. And much of the palace floors and some of the columns and parts of the walls are still there. Huge swimming pool that is there, about an Olympic-sized swimming pool is still there. The remains of water fountains that were shooting up water and stuff. Yes, the Romans did stuff like this. And Jericho, of course, is mentioned in the book of Joshua. It's mentioned a couple of other times, but I want to focus on the story of Jericho. Because when you go to a major university, a secular university in particular, though some Christian universities unfortunately teach this too, they say that the biblical account in the book of Joshua pertaining to Jericho is not true. Because they say primarily there was no Israelites that went through here and did this. If they do agree that Jericho was destroyed, but not at the time period that the Bible gives us, and I'm going to give you tonight exactly within a few years when this event took place in the Bible. And so they say it was primarily the Egyptians who destroyed the city. Well, I'm going to shoot that theory down because it's not true, and the evidence is overwhelming. There's been a lot of digs done here. Over the years. Now, biblical archaeology, for those of you who do not know, biblical archaeology is sort of a new science. It's sort of like genetics. You all know about the science of genetics. Well, biblical archaeology, that science, is about the same age as the science of genetics. Oh, if we were in class right now, I'd say, okay, 50 bonus points for anybody who can tell me who was the father of modern genetics. No. I worked in genetics, but I'm not that old. I might look it. Mendel. The guy with the pea pods, right. The guy who did the pea crossing. He was a priest, and he did that as a hobby. And that was the birth of genetics. And that was in the just the latter part of the mid 1800s is where we're starting to get into there. So that's when genetics started. That is also when biblical archaeology really started, was in the latter part, like around 1870, 1880 is when it really started to be born. And today, oh my gosh, right now there are 14 different digs taking place even right this moment. Well, right now it's sort of early in the morning there. It's about 7 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. But so they're probably not digging right now. But in a few hours, they're going to go back and they're going to start digging. There's 14 different digs just in the city of Jerusalem alone. They're doing so many digs right now all over the country. And if you want to participate in a dig, you just let me know. I can connect you with Dr. Steve Notley, who is doing a dig up on the north side of the Sea of Galilee with the ancient city of Bethsaida. And that is the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And it's a new discovery, actually. Now, some of you might have been to Israel sometime in the past, and they took you to a place about 2.5 kilometers away from the Sea of Galilee, and they say that this is the fishing village. That is not the right place. And just in the last couple of years, they now have found the real city of the apostles. And so this being dug there, Dr. Stephen Notley, a very dear friend of mine, who I co-lead tours with to Israel, he is one of the primary people on that dig. And he's looking for people to help him this summer. So if you would like to, you can talk to me. I can connect you with him. It's hot. This is an area that's very warm. This is down by the Dead Sea, or where the Dead Sea is starting to come into form at the north side of it. It gets really hot there. Some of these pictures, when I was taking these pictures, it was about 110. And it just is baking sun hot, because that's why all this mud is dried and everything. They don't get very much rain there. It does not rain very often. It is close to the Jordan River. If you look over to the side here on the right, you'll see there's palm trees, and sometimes Jericho is called in the Bible the city of palms. These are date palms that grow there, and they grow all around. It's like a little oasis, because there was a well here of water. It's still there to this day, and it has a biblical story later in the book of Kings with the prophet Elisha. He goes there, and the water, he purifies the water. Well, actually, God does through Elisha and purifies the water. And that well is still there today. And but you got to have water to live in a place like this. Wherever you have a good water source in the ancient world, and there was a road nearby, they would build a city there. And that was how they determined where they were going to build. So this is Jericho. It's not, unlike what you might see in movies or in animation on films and stuff, Jericho was not a very big city. It wasn't a super powerful city. It's just that it's the first city when the Israelites at the end of the Exodus come into the Promised Land. It was the first city of the Canaanites that they attacked. And because of that, sometimes we got this mental image that this city was a big, massive fortress and stuff. No, it wasn't. You can walk around this city here in probably about 10 minutes. You can walk all the way around it. It's not that large. And it's primarily baked mud. But there are buildings and stuff that you'll be able to see as we go through this. From the air, this is what it looks like. It's not very impressive to most people. You look at this and you're like, okay, what's there? You know, you expect in archaeology to see a lot of things. Well, there's not a lot there, a lot of holes in the ground as we get into that. But like I say, archaeology is still sort of a new science. Today, there's a lot of digs going on. As I mentioned before, the Italians are digging here. They started around 2015. The Church of Rome is actually sponsoring a lot of the dig here, and they're trying to make it into a park. And so they're putting benches and things all around in this area. So they're making it like that, but it's still in the early stages of the science. Interesting story about the birth of archaeology I was mentioning. The person who is often credited as being the father of modern biblical archaeology was a guy by the name of William Ramsay. William Ramsay was an Oxford professor of history. He was also a non-believer, an atheist. He hated the Bible. He hated Christians. He hated Jews. He didn't like anything pertaining to the Bible. So he often went around, not just at Oxford, but he went around in many countries teaching that the Bible was not true. And getting so frustrated with Christians in particular, he finally decided, I'm going to go to Israel, and I'm going to go through the Holy Land, and I'm going to prove to the world, he was one of these, I'm going to get rid of this book. And so he says, I'm going to use two books, the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Acts was written by Dr. Luke. And so with those two books, he says, I will disprove the Bible. So he goes off, and he travels all the way to the Holy Land. He went to Israel, he went to Syria, Lebanon, he went up into Turkey, went over into Greece somewhat, spent most of his time in Israel and in Turkey. But the thing is, as he's trying to disprove the Bible, he kept finding things that the Bible was correct. Kept finding discoveries and stuff that fit the Bible. What ended up happening, make a long story short, he became a born-again Christian. Goes back to England, and does just the opposite of what he set out to do. Now he's preaching that the Bible is true. And he was knighted by Queen Victoria, even because of all of this. And he's often called the father of modern archaeology. But he's not the first. He did not dig here, because this didn't really pertain too much to the book of Luke or to the book of Acts. So the first digs being done here were done by two Germans. And I've given you the dates of when they did their dig. It was starting in 1907 to 1909. So more than 100 years ago was the first digs. And the two guys who did it, Karl Watzinger and Ernst Sellen, were the two archaeologists. Now, you got to think, at this time period, archaeology has only been around for about 30 years, the science. So there's not many people in the field. Plus, no one knew how to do it. So literally what these two guys did, they went to Jericho, and they were not believers. They didn't believe in the Bible, but they wanted to find out if this place where I just showed you the map or the photo of it, because legend was all around there that this was the ancient city of Jericho, he wanted to find out any evidence that the Bible could possibly be true. They didn't believe it. So what they did, like I say, it's a new science. They literally went to that mound and just started digging holes at random. Because it's just a pile of mud at that point. You couldn't see any buildings or any artifacts, so they just literally just went up to places and started digging holes. They dug down several meters down into the ground. If they found something, wow, we found something. Most of the time, they didn't find anything but ash and rock. They didn't find much. Then they would go over to another spot. Well, we haven't dug over there. Let's go dig over there. And they just walk over. Well, this looks like a good place, and they'd start digging a hole. But they did make some discoveries. And they published their discoveries, these two Germans did. And part of their discoveries that they found was that Jericho didn't have one wall, it had two walls that went around the city. They also found out that the walls had fallen. So we're thinking probably like an earthquake. They looked around some other things. They found some broken pieces of pottery and stuff. And pottery is important because pottery is how archaeologists, even to this day, how we often date things. There's a saying, an archaeologist will date any old thing. It's sort of I'm getting a look from my wife right now because I have a T-shirt that says archaeologists will date any old thing, and she hates me wearing that. So particularly if I'm walking, she gets really mad. It's a little play on words, but they use pottery to date things, because now you might be thinking, well, how can pottery date things? And this is going to be important as we go through this lesson. I have here a piece of pottery, broken pottery, from Jericho. And on one side, it looks very plain and very ugly. Some cracks in it that says that there was a lot of heat here at one point. The other side is painted, and it has two colors of paint. There's a reddish color, and if I sprayed this with water, you would see there's some black decorative lines that will appear with water on them. So this is probably from a water cast, but anyway, this is a piece of pottery. Now, I know you're sitting some distance from me, but you can probably gather that's pretty thick. That's almost a half-inch thick. This is very old. And if you were here for one of the earlier sessions, this is from Megiddo, further to the north, about 40 miles. And this one is very, very thick. This is the bottom of a pot, and it's very thick also. And you can see these two are about the same thickness. This one is from about 2000 BC, this one here. This one is around 1400 BC. But then if you pick up pottery, say, from the time of Christ, they had improved the methods of making pottery. So if you see the thickness of this one, as I told, this is like 1400 BC. This is around the first century, the time of Christ and the apostles. You'll notice this one is much thinner. And it's got a little decoration. It's different. But the thinner the pottery, the finer grains, this has rough grain, this has much finer grain. This is much newer. So pottery can date things, and there's different types of pottery that we have that help us date things, different type of oil lamps, different types of pots themselves, the decoration on pots. It's sort of like giving you an example of how pottery is used for dating. It's sort of like talking, like men, you will understand what I'm talking about here. Maybe 3 or 4 ladies will get this too, because it's more of a guy thing. You know how guys, a husband and wife be driving down the road, cars passing and stuff like this, and all of a sudden the husband will just blurt out, "Oh my gosh, a 57 Chevy," as it goes by. You know those kind of guys that do that? "Oh, a 57 Chevy." How do they know it's a 57 Chevy? By the model, the design of it. You know, my wife probably, not embarrassing her or anything, she could care less about cars as long as she turns the key and it runs. And so she would not know the difference between a 57 Chevy and a 64 Chevy or a 70 Chevy if it doesn't have rust on it. That's how a lot of people are. Pottery is like this. By looking at pottery, you can determine what year, roughly, what dynasty, what period of time something came from. So pottery is key in archaeology. You want to make an archaeologist happy? Send them pottery, ancient pottery. They go crazy. I do too. I go nuts over ancient pottery. I have a bag at home just full of ancient pottery, broken pieces and stuff, and I love that kind of thing. So these guys did find pottery, and they found some pieces that were showing, wow, this is really old, maybe 1500 BC, maybe 1400, in that range. They didn't know because it was too new of a science. But they published their works, and that's what came up. They said, their conclusion was, this doesn't fit the biblical story. It doesn't appear that the biblical story took place. They did find that the city had burned, but a lot of cities burned, so they didn't put much evidence in that, but they published in their works, Jericho did not fit the biblical story. Now, you go about 30 years more, we come to this guy, John Garstang. He's an Englishman. John Garstang, he reads the 2 Germans, their report and stuff like this. He is not a believer either. I have read many of his papers. I've never come across anything that told me he was ever a Christian. But he was open-minded on things, which was really interesting as a scientist. I mean, truly open-minded. He was going to look at the evidence, and where the evidence pointed, that's where he went. So he goes there. Between 1930 and 1936, he goes to Jericho and does a major dig there. And he digs in all different sections. Now, 30 years, they've learned a little bit more of how to do digging. You just don't dig holes in the ground. You quarter sections off. And if you were here this morning, when we did the dig, we had a section where you dig. We just didn't have you dig everywhere. We had you dig in a section and go down, through this in layers. That's what Garstang started doing. He was using modern technology at that point and doing a more studied dig on this. Now, what he discovered was fascinating. He too agreed. There were 2 walls that surrounded Jericho, 2 huge, thick walls that went around it. He also said people were living in houses built right into the walls. That's interesting. Now, if you know the story of Jericho, this is going to make a lot of sense, because he says, yeah, there's definitely houses built into the walls. He also studied, and he says that apparently all of the walls fell all the way around except on the north side. Okay. He also found out this. The walls just didn't collapse like an earthquake, like what just happened in Turkey, where stuff just falls flat. He said, no, all the walls fell outward. Everything was pushed outward. So if a battering ram was to come up and be used to hit this wall, and there's nothing on the other side, the stuff's going to fall on the other side. That's not the way it was. He says everything was found outside the city, so the walls fell outward. He said, very, very strange occurrence. He also started studying the Bible through this time. He didn't, like I say, I don't think he ever became a believer, but he started to think maybe the Bible is true on this, at least on this historic account, because he said, now the Bible says, and we're going to talk about this, that the Jordan River stopped flowing. He thought, that's strange, because the Jordan River is right by there. And he did some research and did find out that there have been a couple of periodic times in history, documented in history, the Jordan River stopped flowing. Mostly it was because of an earthquake way further up north and mudslides blocking it off, where it would be dry for periods of time. So he started finding things like that the city walls fell outward. He also found a lot of different type of pottery. And as I said, pottery is important for dating things. He found a type of pottery, I'm going to talk about it later. It's called Cypriot by chromeware, and he found some of this over on one side in the rich-like area where the people, you can tell by the pottery, they had, more money, certain people did, the higher society people, and he found some broken pieces of pottery there. So he's finding stuff, and he was like, wow, the city has been burned. Ash everywhere, wooden beams, charred black. One of his most amazing discoveries is he found pots that had grain in them, and the grain had been burned inside the pot. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what does that mean? When you conquered a city in ancient time, the primary way you conquered a city, battering rams at the time of Jericho had not been invented. So the way you conquered a city, you surround the city. If possible, you cut off the water supply. To cut down the water, they're going to surrender. But if you couldn't, like Jericho had a well inside and outside the city, but you would surround the city and then starve them into submission. This city, he said, fell, and they didn't collect the food, whoever did it, and they left all the food, all the wealth. Major things were found inside the city. It had not been ransacked. And he was like, this is really strange. And reading through the Bible, Garstang started to see, this is like what the Bible says. So he publishes a paper in the latter 1930s saying that the story of Jericho that we read in the Bible actually happened. He even dated with the pottery to the time period of what the Bible said, which you're going to see, and I'm going to keep talking about, around 1400 BC. He said, this all fits the biblical story. And he says, I believe that the Bible is true on the Jericho account. So he publishes the paper. So now universities all over the world, World War II comes up right now at this point, and things sort of that stops archaeological digs for a while. But certain universities are, they're still teaching, and they're teaching now that Garstang is correct. Well, Garstang, as I said, he was from England, and he handed his paper one day to a young, upstart, new archaeologist, a female, and her name is Kathleen Kenyon. Kathleen Kenyon was an expert. She was very young. She was like in her latter 20s at this point, and she read his paper. She was an expert on medieval England. That's what her expertise was, medieval England. So Garstang just gave her a copy of the paper and said, everybody knew she was pretty brilliant. And says, would you read this and tell me what you think about it? So she read it, and she thought, this is really interesting. Now, she is not a believer. She says, this is really interesting. It intrigued her so much, she went to Jericho and did her own digs between 1952 and 1958. She did a lot of digging in Jerusalem and in other places, but she spent a lot of time in other places like Jerusalem than she did at Jericho. But she did periodically go and dig at Jericho from 52 to 58. She never completed her dig because she died. And so she did not publish her papers on this. She published a couple little pamphlets, but she never published all of her research. Her assistants took her notes and stuff, tried to figure out what she was talking about, and they published her papers. Her conclusion was this: Jericho, what she found, 2 walls all the way around the city. Also, second thing, the walls did fall outward, which she says must have been an earthquake. But it's very strange, she says, because they all fell outward, except at one point. And people had built their houses into the wall. She said, yeah, Garstang was totally correct on this. She says the city was burned and utterly destroyed with everything in it. People were burned up in it. Food was still in it. All this, the pots, everything. The harvest was still sitting in the city. No one scavenged through the thing. They just burned the city and left. But she was looking at pottery too, and she concluded, based just on the pottery, that Jericho fell much earlier, around 1550. Thus, she says, it could not have been the Israelites, and the Bible is wrong. She says there was a group of Egyptians that were being chased out of Egypt, the Hyksos, were being chased out, and she says, I believe they are the people who destroyed Jericho. And on their way out of Egypt, going up up along the Mediterranean there, going upward to the north. They would pass through Jericho, and they're the ones who destroyed Jericho. So she says, Garstang, brilliant paper, but you're wrong on the date. Everything else she agreed with, but she says it's not the date, thus it's not the Israelites. Now this is interesting because you have two brilliant archaeologists, Garstang saying the Bible is absolutely correct. Kenyon says, no, it's not quite right because the time is wrong. So which one is it? Well, because Kenyon became so famous, she was named by the Queen Elizabeth and stuff, so her paper is the one that is all used today in universities. So if you go to university, you study archaeology, you're not going to read too much on Garstang. You're going to read Kathleen Kenyon. This is what is being taught, and Jericho did not fall at the time the Bible says. It was not the Israelites who did it. It was an earthquake who did it, which probably caused a fire throughout the city, and that's what happened. She says the biblical account is not true. But remember, she's not the one who published her paper. It was assistants that did it. But that is what is studied everywhere, whenever you go to almost any university. Well, because you have such conflicting ideas on this, which one's right? So we get to the 1990s, and we come across an American by the name of Dr. Bryant Wood from Princeton University, and he goes over to Jericho, and he says, how could both these guys come across looking at the same stuff and come across with different conclusions? So Bryant Wood started digging there, and he went through, he started from scratch. He had both their papers and also the German team too, and he had all of this stuff, but he conducted his own dig all around using the most scientific methods now, because we're in the 1990s, and what he discovered was fascinating. Now, we're going to go through a lot of what Dr. Bryant Wood found, but now you know the main characters who are doing the dig. So as I go through things, I'll be able to talk back to who did what, and you'll be able to keep track of all this, hopefully, with me. So let's go to the book of Joshua, because Bryant Wood said the biblical account is the real one. What did he find that was so different? What happened? Let's go back to Jericho, or Joshua, to see the story of Jericho. Now, we're going to be taking the English Standard Version, which is a word-for-word translation, and because some of the words are going to be important here that we want to get into. In Joshua chapter 2, you guys know the story. Before Joshua conquers Jericho, he sends spies into the city. Joshua 2:6, they run into this person named Rahab, if you will, and she hides them. Remember where she hides them? On the roof of her house, which is in the city wall, because it says that she had a window that was in the wall. She let the spies sneak out. But she hid them because the king of Jericho heard that Israelite spies. Israelites are just on the other side of the Jordan River. They could see the Israelite camp from Jericho. And spies had come over, and she hides them, as it says here. She brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. Now, this is important because this verse tells us the harvest season. They've already taken in the harvest. The city's full of food. And they're drying the food out all around in the city and stuff. So the harvest season. So this is in the springtime is when this takes place. So this gives us a time frame also. This is in the spring. But we're going to get another clue about this later on. But this is important. Now, as I said, they send spies in first. Joshua sent spies. To do this, they had to cross the Jordan River, and then the Israelites would have to cross the Jordan to come over. And there's a miracle that takes place. Well, here's the Jordan River right by Jericho. This is very close to Jericho. And today, I took this back. I think this picture's in 2010 or 2012, somewhere around there. And you can see it's not a real wide river. Actually, today, it's only, in some cases, only 10 feet wide, the river. And it's very shallow. It's very muddy and everything like this. But this is close to Jericho. You can see it's all green all around the Jordan River. But this is the Jordan River. The Jordan River, you can see it from Jericho. Here I am standing on top of the mound, the tell of Jericho. And the green line, I'll show it to you here. This green area back here is the green area where the river is. So the river's inside this green. It's hard to tell with this picture. It's perfectly on these computers, but you lose some things with the lights here. There are mountains and stuff in the back here. That's the land of Moab. Today, it's called Jordan. So the Israelites are in Moab, over in this area, and now they're going to cross the Jordan River and come over here. But you can see the Jordan from this. So from Jericho, sitting up here in the palace, the king could see the mass amount of Israelites on the other side of the Jordan. So they know they're coming. That's why they were looking for the spies. We pick up the story again, Joshua 3, verses 15 through 17. A miracle happens. As soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests dipped into the bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now get this. Now the Jordan River overflows all its banks throughout the time of the harvest. Now Wood and Garstang both took note of this verse, that there was a flood going on. And it continues, now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. The Jordan dried up for a short period of time, a miracle occurring, that Israel then crossed over, and the people in Jericho could see this. They can see the Israelites coming across. They think they're protected because it said that the Jordan's in flood stage. The flood, that floodplain from that time period, around 1400, that would have been about a mile wide. So people in Jericho think they're pretty safe at this point because the armies of the Israelites are on the other side of the Jordan. There's a mile flood, at least a mile wide, between them and the Israelites. They considered themselves safe. But as I said, you can see the Jordan. Thus, they would have been witness standing at the walls watching the river stop and the Israelites come across. And not just the river, the whole flood stage opened up. Remember in Scripture it tells us that the people in the city were terrified. Rahab tells that to the spies. It says, the people, our inhabitants, were terrified of your God. Yeah, they have now seen this flood water open up and the Israelites come across. These people have to be terrified because this doesn't happen every day. So we have that occurring. The Jordan overflows its banks, and there's so many records of this going back, seasonally because of the rains that happen during the wintertime. Water comes down, fills into the Jordan, and comes down to the Dead Sea. And a lot of this happens in the spring because the snow up on the very northern edge of Israel is Mount Hermon. And it always has snow on it. And so it's an interesting thing. You can go skiing even in the summertime in Israel on Mount Hermon, and it's a very high mountain, and you can go skiing and then get in your car after that and drive down to the Dead Sea about an hour and a half later and go swimming in the hot water of the Dead Sea because it's about 100 degrees or 90 degrees down there easy. So it's an interesting place. So that's why we have this flood, and it happens yearly. So the inhabitants of Jericho see the Israelites are thinking we're safe because we got this flood between us. Then all of a sudden they see the water open up. Israelites come across. Oh my gosh, this is terrifying. But that's when they're coming. You understand? This had to have happened because we have this city being destroyed. And as I said, from standing here, you can see all the way into Moab, or today into Jordan. So they would be able to witness this. Then the Israelites would be camped in this area back along here. There's a lot of Israelites that would be camped outside of here, now ready to attack them. We pick up the biblical story. Joshua chapter 5, now verses 10 and 11. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover. There's another key. On the 14th day of the month in the evening of the plains of Jericho. So they're on the plains of Jericho, just outside. The day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce on the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. Isn't it interesting that God had the Israelites come in at the end of the harvest? All the food is already picked. The cities have taken in the harvest, and God says, now come in and inhabit them. So that's what's going on. But this tells us Passover. When's Passover? Easter. Our present day Easter, that's Passover. And so, again, we know we're in the springtime as this happens, and that's when the floods always happen. And as I said, Jericho was not defeated by the use of war machines like battering rams. This is a picture I showed earlier in another presentation of the last night of the Lachish battle with King Sennacherib knocking over the city of Lachish. This is a battering ram, armored battering rams. The Assyrians invented this, but it would be 700 years later. So there are no battering rams at this point. No one's invented them yet. So you starve cities into submission. That's how you did it. We pick up the story some more. Joshua chapter 6 now, verses 20 and 21. And you know how this goes. We even have the song, Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and stuff. We have this in the song. So the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city, get that, all in the city to destruction, both men, women, young and old, oxen, sheep, donkeys, with the edge of the sword. Now I want to just go on a little rabbit trail with you for just a second, because I know some people are probably thinking this. How mean of an action did God do by killing all these innocent people? Let me tell you, folks, they weren't innocent. They all refused to worship God. They knew who God was. We have evidence of that because Rahab and her family believed in God. Those who believed in God, God saved. Those who did not, he put to death. Their time of judgment had come. We also know from ancient writings and stuff that the religion of these people, these Canaanites, was extremely vulgar. I won't go into the details of it because of the age of some people in here, but it was extremely immoral, and they refused to worship God. Thus, they are a cancer. God had warned them. They knew about who God was. There's no question. Rahab heard about the miracles that God did in Egypt with Moses. They knew who God was. They intentionally said, we are not going to worship that God. We're going to worship our gods. We're going to continue doing our immoral life. We don't care what you say. And God says, which he does at times, your time has come to an end. It's now time for judgment. That's what happened here. So he's not killing innocent people. He's killing people. And this takes place all through Canaan. Anybody who turns to God, and if you read the story of the conquest carefully, if you read the story of even in the books of Samuel, people, though they're not Hebrew, people who turned to believe in God, trust in him, commit themselves to him, God does not kill them. God redeems them. I'll give you an example. When we get to the time of David, David murders somebody and steals his wife. What was his name? Uriah. We just don't call him Uriah. We often call him Uriah the Hittite. What's that mean? He's from Turkey. That was the kingdom of the Hittites. But he was a man who was devoted to God. He believed in God. David also had a whole lot of Philistines that were his personal army. Philistines had other gods, but these people had turned to the true God. God includes them in here. Rahab is someone who put her trust and faith in God. God redeems her, saves her. When people turn to God, no matter what they had done, somebody who turns to God, and it's true even to this day, you cannot out-sin the grace of God. And if you turn to God, believe, put your faith and trust in him, he will save you, no matter what you did. He did it to these extremely immoral Canaanites and all these other nations. But anybody who turned to him, he's saved. So I'll go off the rabbit trail. We'll continue with the story here. Joshua 6:24. They came in now and they burned the city with fire, everything in it. Only the silver and gold vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So they kept the most valuable things, but everything else, all the clothing, all of the nice wares, pottery, beautiful things like that, nope, it was all destroyed. Everything was burned. It's an offering. What did you do with the sacrifice? You burned it. It's an offering. That's what is being set up here. The only survivors of the city were Rahab and her family who turned to God for salvation. They lived in a section of the wall. Now, it's interesting because Garstang and Bryant Wood both found sections. I'm going to show you a picture of part of the wall that did not fall. There is a place they have dug out now with part of the wall there where there's even a window in it. Now, I'm not saying that that was Rahab's house, but that definitely shows that there were sections of the wall that did not fall. You'll see that in a bit. We continue, verse 25. But Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's household, and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. By the way, you know that the name Joshua is the Hebrew name for Jesus. Same thing. Isn't that interesting? Joshua saved. Yeshua saved. How cool. Question. Right, we don't know. There's no name written on the wall saying Rahab lived here. You know, they just didn't do that. But there are houses in one section of the city, in a small section, that wall did not fall. And I'll show it to you in a little bit. So she lived in Israel to this day. She hid the messengers. And we know if you study the genealogy of Jesus, she becomes an ancestor of Jesus. Jesus is born as a result of her marrying into the tribe of Judah. How cool is that? So now let's look at what we've got here. All archaeologists, as I told you, every single one of them agree Jericho had two walls, not one, two walls, which was very common in Canaan, to have two walls around a city. And what you're looking at here, I'll try and point out, this large trench here, that was dug by Kathleen Kenyon. She took out a whole section looking for things. This bottom part right here is the bottom part, what we call a rampart, or the foundation wall, where the mud brick walls would be set up on top. This is the foundation. Now, what you see over here in this section is a second wall. There's actually a gap of space and a little road that's between this wall and that wall. The bottom part right here is an external tower that was destroyed. This is mostly mud and ashes because Jericho was rebuilt a couple of times and it was destroyed. It was rebuilt. It was destroyed a couple of times. Moab even takes it over at one point and they build it into an outpost after the destruction and stuff. So what you're looking at, this retaining wall, that's what this was. What I was just showing you, that's this. And there's a bunch of debris and stuff in here that they do to fill this in. This is the foundation that's going to hold the walls. So this is not part of the wall that fell. This is the base of the wall that fell. Here's another picture now showing you how this is set up. Here's the retaining wall like I was showing you. Here would be the mud bricks that make up the outer wall. Then up here further, there'd be another rampart wall, another one of these further up, so there'd be a space in between. Looking at this picture gives you an idea of how Jericho was set up. And we have some people drawn in here to give you a scale to let you see how tall the wall is. The outside wall, this one here, it's about 7 meters. That's about 23 feet from the bottom to the top. So about 23 feet. That would be, I'm just guessing here, if a basketball hoop is 10 feet off the floor, so more than double that. So about the top of the beam, more than top of the beam, maybe not quite to the apex up there, roughly 23 feet. Gives you an idea of how tall the wall was. So that's a pretty tall wall. Then there's this area in between. You have the rampart here. In between here, there were houses and stuff and a street that ran through here in between, and then there's another wall. This wall is about, from the rampart, about 30 feet, so it's a little higher than this one. So that's how this was set up. And the distance here that you see, this, as it says, it varies in different areas around the city. They're just following the contour of the city as that goes like that. So let me take you back and show you this part right here. This is it. This is the rampart wall. I'm standing on part of the rampart wall, photographing downward. This was a tower, a large tower that was set there. And then back behind here is in between the two walls. But you can see that how this was set up. Now, where's the mud bricks that made up the upper wall? They're not there. And looking back at this picture, the mud bricks, you wouldn't be able to see in here because there'd be mud bricks on this bottom wall. There'd be another set of mud bricks on top of this one. They're not there. Or if I scan this back a little further, you can see here's the rampart wall. Second wall here has not been dug out, but you can see that this is how the rampart as you walk up. And by the way, this was all underground until Kathleen Kenyon's dig in the 50s dug most of this out through here. And what she found was a whole lot of mud bricks. But let me give you now an image of what archaeologists believe Jericho looked like. This was ancient Jericho. It had a gate system here. A gate is just not a door, it's a large structure, an armored structure to protect the gates, the doorways. You would come into Jericho through here. You could come in through the first gate. Now you see how houses are built right in here against the walls. And up here you can see they're built right up against the walls on the outside. Here's a house that's built right onto the outside of the wall here. You have an inner wall, and it too has houses built right up to the inside of the wall. On both sides they would do this. Here was like a temple. This was like the palace. And they have this thing set up in that aspect. And by the way, the mud in this area is pink. So the city was pink in color. It has a reddish tint to it. It really does. So just gives you an idea there. Matter of fact, I talked about this earlier. This oil lamp came from an area very close to that, to Jericho. And you notice it's got like a pinkish hue to it. That was the color of the mud bricks at Jericho. Well, what happened was the walls, according to the Bible, the walls fell. But what archaeologists found, they just didn't fall down like an earthquake. Though that's what Kathleen Kenyon said. Garstang said no, because they all fell outward. Dr. Wood comes along. He says all the walls fell outward. So when the walls fell, they fell this way. If you got battering rams or pushing, it's going to go the other way. The pile of bricks will be on the inside. It's not like that anywhere around the city. Everything, it fell outward. That's very odd, that nothing fell in. It all fell outward, like up here. It falls outward. Let's pick up the story again. Joshua 6:20. It says, the people shouted, the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city. Every man straight before him, they captured the city. You see what it says here? Went up. When the mud bricks fell outward, now they had a stairway going up into the city. The biblical description is perfect because the Hebrew here is talking about the people going up, climbing up into the city. It fits perfectly because that's what it says. They went up into the city. And here, let's picture, who's that funny looking guy? But you can see here, there's a tower right here behind me. Here's a rampart wall here. But there was a large tower built right, like we saw in the earlier picture, with towers along the sides. And there's a large tower right there, and there's part of the rampart. So I want to show you this picture, though, because you see, with all this falling out, you have a ramp now. You can walk all the way up into the city. Matter of fact, that's how you walk into the city. There's a path. You walk up over this. So when the walls fell, the wall that was standing here fell downward and made this ramp. It gives them a perfect way to walk up. Now, like I say, even Kathleen Kenyon caught this. I'm going to show you a picture of her paper. This is actually from her paper. And it shows she's drawing pictures here. Here's the rampart. See, this was all underground when she started digging. But she dug down, and all of a sudden she found all these fallen bricks, all fallen outward. And here's the rampart. Today, all this has been taken out. Unfortunately, what Kathleen Kenyon did with all of the bricks all around the city, she had them removed by dump trucks, taken to a place and destroyed. Today, they would never do that. But that's what she did. Unfortunately, almost all of those bricks are now gone. You have to look hard to find them. I did. I walked around. I could find them. Every now and then you can see them. This is Dr. Wood standing up on top, and he's pointing down here. He's talking about where Kathleen Kenyon found all these mud bricks. This is a tower structure here. Everything fell. The towers fell, and all the bricks fell down in here. And there's, if you look and you start digging around in here, you're not supposed to do that, though. You can find, every now and then, there's a brick you'll find that they left. And, yeah, you can't touch them. It's illegal to touch. But like I said, the Bible tells us not all of the walls fell. Where Rahab was living, her house stayed. This is what Garstang found. See the rampart wall here? I took this picture here showing where Garstang dug. There's part of the wall. It's on the north side. Sections are still standing. And as I say, there's one part over. My photograph did not come out very well. You can't really tell what I was photographing. But in one of these, there is a small window. It's been collapsed, but you can see there's a small window in there, showing that on that side of the wall, there was a house at one point. Then we get to Joshua 6:24. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it, only the silver, gold, vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the Lord. So everything that they had of gold and silver and stuff, they took, but they left all the major wealth, the pottery, the beautiful vessels, everything that was nice to look at. They left it there and they destroyed it. They burned it all. Now, this is what's so unusual, and here's a problem with Kathleen Kenyon's summation of all this. You see, this is very unusual to destroy a city at that time period and then to just burn everything in there, the food. All the food. Why would they burn the food? If you're starving the city into submission, you're going to probably want to keep the food that they have, if they, any food they got left over, because you got troops to feed. But she says that's not what it was. It was the Egyptians fleeing from Egypt. The Hyksos were fleeing through this land, and so they conquered the city, and as they were running away, they just torched it all. Why would they leave the food? Why would they torch places in the city where there's Egyptian symbols and stuff? Why did they destroy Egyptian things if these are Egyptians doing this? See, part of her theory, Dr. Wood particularly wrote about this, does not make sense. There's only one group that would come through in history that we're ever reading about that would destroy a city and leave everything in it except the silver, gold, and iron and bronze. But everything else of value, all the clothing, all the food, the food itself, everything like this, they burned it all. Doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't you take the food with you? The only thing, as Garstang said and Dr. Wood said, the only thing that makes sense, it was the Israelites coming through. And we're told, don't touch the food. You burn it. That's what this is getting into. And as it says, as I told you before, they burned it, which is like a sacrifice. God was setting in place something for us that we can learn even to this day. And he makes it into the law that Moses gave, from God, gave to the people. In Deuteronomy 8:14, it says, the first fruits of your grain, your wine, of your oil, and your fleece of your sheep, you give to him, meaning God. That was in the law. So they had just got this, so this is fresh in their mind. 2 Chronicles 31, verse 5, as soon as the command was spread among the people of Israel, they gave in abundance the first fruits of grain, wine, honey, oil, all that was produced in the field. They brought it in abundance as a tithe, as a sacrifice to God. We see this also in Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 35. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all the fruit of every tree year by year to the house of the Lord. You see, God was putting into place a principle. The Israelites are coming into the promised land that he is giving them. The first city, now they get to live in all the other cities. They get to do that. You just go in and he tells them, live in their houses, take their food that they harvest. This is my gift for you for following me. This is your gift. But this first city belongs to me, and you sacrifice it to me. The wealth, the gold, the silver, goes into the treasury of the Lord. Everything else is a sacrifice to me. And that's what we're seeing here. Even Paul writes about this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 3, 4, and 5, we read, for they gave accordance to their means, talking about this church, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own free will, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints, and this, not as we expected, but here we go, get this. But they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. God has put into place, both in the Old Testament and New Testament, when you get something, a gift, a paycheck for working, or whatever, the first part belongs to Him. The first part belongs to Him. Old covenant, new covenant. First goes to God. Thus, I believe, taking this, that when you get a paycheck, you get your paycheck from work or they pay you in cash or whatever, oh, let's go out and celebrate. No, you set aside money first to give to God before you do anything else with it. That's the principle He's giving us here, the first fruits, as it's often called. God is doing this. And the whole story with Jericho, it's a first fruits. The first city they get, you don't get to live in this one. This one belongs to me. You're going to sacrifice this to me. We just got, this past week, we had a very interesting thing happen in our family. We had some major car trouble, and my wife, who is, her nickname is the Queen of Treats, as Daryl pointed out in one of his introductions here earlier about us, she makes treats for everything. Whenever I teach classes, even when I was a teacher in school, she would make treats for my students. And when I'm teaching at places, she often makes treats when I'm going to some place. To give to the people for having to suffer through listening for me, to me through the whole thing. So she does stuff like, she makes phenomenal treats. I mean, she is a baker and a half. Well, she kills ovens. An oven doesn't last long in my house because she works it to death, baking stuff all the time. So our oven broke the other day, which was a major thing. Our car broke down just before coming down here, and we put it out to God. God, this is your problem. You fix it. And it just so happened, as we're praying this past week, we got a message from a person. I've never met him before in my life. His wife had attended a women's conference. Believe it or not, I do speak every year at a women's conference. They asked me to do it. She was at the women's conference. She goes home. She talks to her husband and has talked about what she learned there, how the Holy Spirit touched her and stuff like this. And he then was reading Psalm chapter 50, and he realized he does not sacrifice to God. And he put that really got struck on his heart. Then he heard that we were having $2,000 of unexpected bills. So the guy sends me an email asking details of what happened, and I told him, and he said, okay, I feel God is is wanting me to sacrifice. I owe God a lot that I have not given him. Thus, I'm going to send you a check for $2,000 to cover this. It's cool how God does stuff like that. I remember one time years ago, Daryl, I don't know if you remember this, you and Lynn, but when we were attending church and you were our pastor, we had a major problem with our car, and we didn't know how in the world we're going to pay for this and everything. This was not long after we moved up there, and the church took a benevolence offering and stuff like this, which they did every month, and we were like, how in the world are we going to pay for this? And all of a sudden, we got a check in the mail from our church that covered that. It's amazing. I mean, I could go on and on and on in stories like this, but I'm just trying to point out this principle that God's teaching you. So I'm sorry I went on a rabbit trail here, but that's part of the story of Jericho. So just going to say, whatever the Holy Spirit tells you through this, that's what you should do. Now, the city was burned, as it says here. This is from Kathleen Kenyon's digging. I got to show you. This is so cool. You see this gray section right here? That is pure ash. Kathleen Kenyon dug this trench. You can see it's pure ash. All this black around here is carbon from burning. Kathleen Kenyon, Garstang, Kathleen Kenyon, Dr. Wood, they said there's no doubt whatsoever this city was burned. It has just got ash everywhere. And in many cases like this here, that's almost 2 meters thick. That's a big fire. There had to be a lot of buildings here for this to take place. Here is another. You can see a whole layer right here of dark carbon in here. This is ash that they found through here. You keep seeing things like this. Here's a close-up of some rocks here. Again, you can see layers of darkness. You can see it's burned. And there's pieces of pottery and stuff that is embedded in this, which gives us, again, a way of dating things. And so I got to show you one. I was walking along Jericho, and I came across something. People were just walking by, and I saw this. And I almost was literally jumping up and down in excitement. And people were like, you having a seizure or something? You know, what's the matter with you? I said, do you see what's here? I said, do you see this dark spot here? It's a wooden beam. Here's the other side of it. It's been burned. Burned. And you can see then they built again, as the city was rebuilt a couple of times on top of that, they built on top of this. But this beam is still sitting here, burned out of, with ash in it. It was so cool. And as I said, this piece of pottery that I have here, this dates back to about the 15th century, and this shows signs of being burned. Even around the edges, you can see there's markings here having to do with burning. This is from Jericho. It's one of my most prized pieces because it shows it's been painted on one side with two different colors paint, and the other side is just plain, but you can tell this thing has been exposed to a lot of heat. I picked that up in the trash thing. No, I didn't steal it. Back then, they threw it in the trash, and archaeologists said back then you could go through the trash piles and pick things up. And you got to be careful doing that today. But that's what that's showing. There's a really dark line through here showing the burn. Water pots. Garstang found water pots that had been broken and stuff, but they've been cracked, not from just being hit or something. Many of these were cracked because of heat. The clay pots just broke because of the heat. And they also found pots, hundreds of pots full of grain, that the grain is burnt. This one here is full of fruit, burnt. Why would somebody do that? Here's an archaeologist in the Dr. Wood's team that was looking through this and just picking up handfuls of grain as they're digging out these pots. The city was full of food. Hundreds and hundreds of pots. This is Dr. Wood, that's him in the hat there, counting about these pots. And they're doing studies on these pots here as they did this. And some of these pots just full of grain, all burnt. Here's some people scooping it out. Burnt grain all through here. Now, this is so important, as I told you. Pottery can be used for dating things. There exists two ways, basically, of getting a date for when all this took place. One, the pottery itself, pottery, as I said, can give you a date by the style of it, the way it's made. Also, because clay pottery is organic, you can carbon-14 date it. Now, when I say radioactive dating, a lot of times people just immediately, what's the matter with you? Don't talk about that. Radioactive dating, like carbon-14, is great for archaeology. Why is it great for archaeology? Because we can use controls to test to see how accurate we are. If you've taken a dinosaur bone or something like this or some rock, you have no idea. And by the way, when you carbon date, you often don't get just one date. You get a whole series of possible dates. So in carbon-14 dating with archaeology, you have controls like the style of the pottery, the artwork on the pottery. Sometimes you can see writing on pottery. Writing is another thing. The way alphabets were made gives us time periods. Thus, you can test that against the dates you get with carbon-14. What Dr. Wood did, because this was not available for the others, but what he did is he had the pottery from these large pots full of food, burnt food. He had them tested to find out what time period did they come from. And they came out to be early 15th century, around 1400 BC. Now, as I said, Kathleen Kenyon, she dated Jericho to be destroyed around 150 years before this, around 1550. And she based that primarily on one thing. And she says this in her paper. I did not find any pottery from Cyprus. She says there's no Cyprus pottery. If it was in the 1400s, there would be Cyprus pottery in the city. There's none here. So because I didn't see it, that tells me it couldn't have happened in 1400. It had to be before that type of pottery was made available. Thus, she puts the date at 1550. That's how she did it. That's a bad way of trying to to date something. She did not use the local pottery. She didn't go through the pottery. She was so single-minded looking for this type of pottery. This is Cyprian by Cromware, Cyprian pottery. She was looking for this, but the sites where she was searching, she was looking primarily in the poor sections, and she didn't find any. Well, this is expensive pottery. Poor people generally will not have this. Dr. Wood caught that right away, and he says, no, that's not right. Because what does Cypriot pottery look like? This is an example of Cypriot pottery dating back to about 1400 BC. This is what we're looking for. And she says, I didn't see any of this. She said in her paper, if I had found this, I would agree with Dr. Garstang that the biblical timeline is correct. It would have been 1400. But she says, because I don't see this, no, it can't be right. Here's a picture of her actually sorting through pottery, looking. She has a caption in her paper on this, looking for Cypriot pottery, and she couldn't find any. She's ignoring all the other pottery that she can use to date it. She's just looking single-handedly for this one type of pottery, which she did not find. Now, here's the kicker. Garstang found it. He found it there. Dr. Wood found it there. I have seen it there. How did she miss it? Is a question no one can understand. How did she miss it? Yes. She didn't believe in the Bible. You're right. She didn't. That's right. Isn't it crazy that she just missed something like that? In fact, how could somebody so brilliant make such a simple mistake? But that's what happened. So Dr. Wood and Garstang both examined the pottery. It's Cypriot pottery dating to about 1400 BC. He had it tested. It also comes out around 1400 BC. Thus, this fits the biblical account. Everything that we read about the Bible in this city, archaeology has shown it to be true. But today, universities and stuff say the Bible's not true because of that. So this was a major piece of evidence found. They just missed it. Now, we can get another idea about the dating of Jericho. We can find out when it took place by reading the Bible. In 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, we read this. This is about Solomon starting to build the temple. He gives us a time frame. In 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, that's the Exodus, Passover and stuff, in the 4th year now of Solomon's reign, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord, his temple. We know roughly when it was built. History records Solomon began the construction around 966, give or take a few years, right around in there. So that verse tells us that when Solomon built the temple around 960 or so BC, you have to go back 480 years earlier to find out when the Exodus took place. 480 years earlier. Well, this is just a simple math problem now, but we're working in BC, so it's like using negative numbers. So we take it's supposed to be 966, not 996. I got a typo there, I see, but the top equation, this is correct. So 966, you go back 480 years, add that to it, you come to 1446 BC. That's the year of the Passover, roughly, give or take a year, right there. Now, remember, the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. And then Jericho is taken. Thus, you take that 446, you add the 40 years of wandering, it takes you to 1406 BC. Thus, Jericho fell around 1406 BC. What has all of the evidence pointed to? All of the pottery, the Cypriot pottery, the carbon-14 of the pottery, the carbon-14 of the fruit and the grain, everything comes out to be around 1400 BC. Kathleen Kenyon was wrong. The Bible is accurate. Yet, there's one more little surprise I got to tell you. Garstang and Wood found something else there. The Egyptians had conquered up into Canaan before the time of the Exodus. The Pharaoh that did this was named Tutmosis III. In the 15th century, or before, just early to the 15th century, Tutmosis III, he was the greatest pharaoh of all time. He conquers all the way up into Turkey and all the way into present-day Iraq. He conquers, and he sets up villages, and he captures the cities and he puts his governors in these. So we might find some Egyptian things in some of these cities that would date back to Tutmosis III. Now, if Kathleen Kenyon is correct, you won't find this because nobody was living there at that time. Understand? Did I make that clear? If you find something with Tutmosis III or his stepmother, Hatshepsut, that means it had to be around 1400, not 1550 because they aren't born yet. What they found were these scarabs, these little tiny pieces here. And if you were in the thing this morning, you saw some of these. And this one here is Tutmosis III. Here's another one, Tutmosis III. They found these. These are the ones Bryant Wood found, but also Garstang found some. Hatshepsut was his stepmother, so they found these in here showing the Egyptians had a presence when Jericho fell. Egyptians were there too. Yes? Well, they would be burned, but this shows that these people were living during this time, because why else would you find anything with Tutmosis III if the city fell 100 years before he's even born? It doesn't make any sense. Kathleen Kenyon didn't see these. She had just ignored what Garstang found on these, didn't pay much attention to it, but Bryant Wood in particular saw these things, and he put 2 and 2 together and got 4 out of this. He says this shows that Kenyon was totally wrong because now we see the Egyptian presence there at the same time. So, in conclusion, what do we have? To wrap this up really quick. Scientists have discovered the conquest happened in the early spring, just like the Bible says, just after the harvest, like the Bible says, because the grain was still there. The storage jars were full, just like the Bible says. It was a short siege because of that. There were houses built right up to the walls, particularly the outer wall, just like the Bible says. The city walls collapsed at the tell, the hill, the mound. They fell down to the bottom of the tell, just like the Bible says. The walls fell, then the cities were burned after the city walls fell. Following the destruction by fire, the main part of the city remained uninhabited for a long period of time. But it does, and according to the Bible, does get rebuilt a couple of times. Another thing, Cypriot pottery was discovered in the wealthy sections of the city. Kathleen Kenyon spent most of her time in the poor sections. Cypriot pottery is expensive. You're not going to expect many of the poor sections to have something that expensive. So she missed this. Few structures were built in the middle of the tell during the time of King Eglon. That's in the book of Judges. He was the king of Moab. It mentions there. And then later on, those were abandoned after the death of Joshua and stuff like this. But then there's even a time in the book of Kings talking about them rebuilding Jericho and stuff. So you do see some other structures up on top and mud bricks again up on top. But that fits again with the biblical account. So, in short, folks, the Bible's true. Jericho supports the Bible. Unlike what you're going to hear in universities, you're not going to hear a lot of this, particularly Bryant Wood's work. They're going to just talk about Kathleen Kenyon. But the evidence is there. I've seen it. The evidence is there. The Bible's true. Well, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to come. Daryl, Lynn, thank you again so much for allowing us to come up here for this archaeology conference. And I hope this has helped you in your faith and to take you and let you see a place that a lot of times you don't get to go to because it's not in the safest area of Israel. But I want to just thank you all for the attention you paid. And thank you for those who were here this morning and came back again. That's awesome seeing you guys and asking questions. I love that. And I know you have food and stuff over here. So, Daryl, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you all so much. God bless. Thank you.